I've never been introduced before as being two for the price of one. I don't know if my talk is going to be two for the price of one, but it leaves great expectations, doesn't it? Thank you, Vineet, so much for inviting me to be here. I feel very honored, and also thank all of you for coming. Familiar faces. I just met Brenda Dunn, a week ago or so, a few days ago, and we have others in the audience who I'm seeing as giving me a sense of support for what I'm doing. What happened to the book? Did you hide it? I'll feel safer if I can. Okay. Yes. Jewel of Wisdom, the Bhagavata Purana as sacred text and living tradition. The subtitle of this volume was indeed Sacred Text and Living Tradition, which is trying to say something about this text, the Bhagavata Purana, which I'll be referring to quite a bit because that's a subject, but probably I'll be abbreviating slightly to say the Bhagavatam. The Bhagavatam, or the Bhagavata Purana. It's something I want to give a sketch about because your general theme of your gatherings is wisdom traditions of India. I guess what I want to present is that this is one very powerful collection of expressions of wisdom, which is lesser known in the West, but is quite well known in India, along with two other texts, the Mahabharata, within which is the Bhagavad Gita, and the Ramayana. These two texts, which are often referred to as epics by scholars in the West, are sort of framing a culture which has come to be called Hinduism. Actually, the term Hinduism, to the best of anyone's knowledge, I believe, doesn't appear until the 19th century, although the word Hindu shows up in some of the literature from the 16th century. It starts to appear in indigenous literature, what we might want to call Hindu literature today. The term starts to get used, but in the tradition itself, by which I mean earlier texts, especially Sanskrit texts, we don't find this term Hindu. And so we're always a little bit, those of us who speak on Hindu traditions, Hindu wisdom, are often feeling a bit awkward. But then again, if you think about so many religious traditions where the term, the name of their tradition comes from outside, Hinduism is not alone. Quakers, I believe, were not calling themselves Quakers, were they? Methodists, perhaps also not, and so on. We could probably think of many such traditions. But another term which may be of use and helpful to appreciate the broader tradition of which I'm speaking is the term Bhagavata. To say this is Bhagavata religion, if you like. One thing I want to also talk about, to speak about the book Bhagavata is a very broad concept of reading. And this comes from Paul Griffiths, professor, I don't know if he's retired, or if he's still active at University of Chicago, wrote a book called Religious Reading, in which he is contrasting what he calls religious reading with what he calls consumer reading. And as you may well imagine, by consumer reading, he means, to a large extent, most of the reading that we do today. It's consumer in the sense that we want to get something from a text, and once we've gotten it, we're finished with it. Rarely do we pick up the same book again. In contrast to this would be what he calls religious reading, which is reading in a spirit which is continually returning to a text again and again and again, because one is experiencing, one is uncovering, one is, realizing so much fresh and new from that text each time you visit it. So he's making this rather sharp distinction between the two to highlight this contrast. And what I want to suggest is that the Bhagavatam it's a text which, in a sense, demands religious reading. And by saying that, I hope I don't turn you off, because we're all accustomed to consumer reading, and if you say, oh, you're going to have to approach this book in a different way, we may want to say, well, then it's not for me. Rather, what I want to suggest is this may be the sort of book by which this type of reading becomes actually rewarding. This is my own experience. I started reading the Bhagavatam in translation in 1972, a few decades ago, and I'm still reading it. Now I'm reading it more with some Sanskrit knowledge. I'm continually working on the Sanskrit knowledge, but the richness of this text just keeps unfolding. I want to say that this book and the other companion volume that this goes with is the work of two of us, myself and my colleague Ravi Gupta. He's now at Utah State University, and it wouldn't have been possible, I think he might agree for both of us, it wouldn't have been possible to put together these books alone. We worked on these for several years together in a extremely rewarding collaboration. And I want to say something about the purpose of our two books to get us into the book about which these two books are written. The purpose of these two books was to help people get into this book because it's a difficult book to enter into. First of all, it is the original language is Sanskrit, not accessible to most of us. But also the cultural assumptions, the presuppositions of the tradition may, at least initially, come to us as barriers to appreciating the text. So what we wanted to do is help to get through these barriers, and then to attempt to position the Bhagavatam not as Hindu literature, not even as Indian literature, but rather as world literature, to try to bring it into that sort of caste, if you like, of world literature, where it could be properly appreciated as a source of wisdom beneficial to all of humankind. So that's been our attempt. It was kind of interesting how we came to publish the second of the two books. We started with this collection of articles as a proposal to the acquisitions editor at Columbia. And we came to a very, say, advanced point of having our proposal accepted, when suddenly she wrote to us and said, "But wait, where is that text, the Bhagavata Purana, for which your book is, as you are calling it, a companion volume? Where is that text?" Well, there are translations, but they're either several volumes, especially the one which I was reading from 1972, the translation of my guru, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, with his commentary. Who's going to sit down and read all of that? Very few people, perhaps. Or you get older translations, the English of which is not pleasant. So then she suggested to us, why don't you write an abridged version of Bhagavatam, translate. So we got two books for the price of one. So I think I'll just tell you a little about the content of this book of articles. And this may give you some sense of what is the content of the Bhagavata. Then I may have a couple more points to make about the general, the thematics of the Bhagavata. And then I thought I'd like to read you a very short section of my own translation from the 10th book of the Bhagavata, to give you a sense of the flavor and some of the richness. And then we can take questions, discussion. So again, this we're calling this sacred text and living tradition, and this points to a division we made in the book. Two parts. The first is called The World of the Bhagavata, and the second part is called The Bhagavata in the World. So we wanted to highlight that there is a world in which to enter by entering into the text. A world which may, in certain respects, be very foreign to us, and yet, with careful reading, comes to resonate with us. And the Bhagavata has been a text since several centuries, if not millennia, with huge impact, especially in India, but also since recent, especially recent decades. It's also been having effect beyond India. So we have altogether 12 scholars writing on different themes, actually 11 plus myself. Beginning, however, first with an introduction in which we introduce one of the stories of the Bhagavata. The Bhagavata is, I would say, first and foremost, narrative. It is telling a story. It is a story which is, in one sense, having neither beginning nor end, and therefore one could ask, what sort of a story is that? In another sense, if you want to say it has a beginning, when you come to the end, you are invited to go back to the beginning. It's a story which begins at the end at the same time. And by that, I mean to say, it begins with the sad knowledge that Krishna, the Bhagavan, the supreme divinity, has departed the world. And what is to be done now that he has departed? That question then becomes a dominant question for the Bhagavata as a whole, and also a similarly foundational question which comes at the end of the first of the 12 books of the Bhagavata, in which the king, who will be hearing the entire Bhagavata, Vishnu Rata, also known as Parikshita, is having been cursed and then accepted the curse willingly, although he could have rejected the curse. He accepts a curse that he will die in 7 days. Having accepted that curse, he approaches the sages for wisdom. What should I do in preparation for my death? His question is essentially, what is the duty of a person who is about to die? And then the answer is the rest of the Bhagavata. And that answer is in the form of narrative. And that narrative weaves in multiple textures of philosophy, of theology, of wisdom, literature, and so on. And all of this we introduce with one of the stories, which is a story of churning. Divine churning. The churning of the cosmic ocean. The churning by, on the one side, the devas, the gods, and on the other side, the asuras, the anti-gods, or demons, who have come together to agreeing to work together, where they're usually fighting with each other. They've agreed now to work together because they have a common interest. And what is their common interest? It is to churn Amrita. The word Mrita in Sanskrit means death. Amrita, non-death, or deathlessness, or immortality, or it simply means nectar, the nectar of immortality. The two do this churning in order to produce out of the cosmic ocean this nectar, which they then desire to drink to become immortal. So that motif becomes very, very important throughout the whole text. The churning of nectar of immortality. How does one churn? By reading, by hearing the text of the Bhagavata. Hearing and speaking what is called Shravanam, hearing, and Kirtanam, speaking, praising, and then more hearing, and then more praise. In the next article, which is my own, I introduce some of the difficulties of reading a Purana. This is the Bhagavata Purana, which is a particular genre of Sanskrit literature, which is having certain presuppositions, we may say, of understanding. What means Purana, some have translated as ancient lore, or we may call it ancient wisdom literature. But I'm giving a kind of, quick start instruction, how to get into the book in my article. Next we hear from Rick Jarrow, who is at Vassar College, who discusses the narrative of the Bhagavata, focusing on the notion of time, past, present, future, and beyond, and how the notion of time is unsettled in the Bhagavata. The fact that the Bhagavata seems to have no beginning and no end. and how the whole idea is to go beyond time. Then we hear from Jonathan Edelman, who is at University of Florida, on the Bhagavata's cosmology. It's a difficult cosmology because it seems to be so utterly different from anything that we are familiar with, that we see, that we are supposed to understand the relationship of the planets and so on, what these relationships are. We get a very different picture in this Purana. It turns out it's part of a bigger tradition, Puranic tradition, which borrows from, or is borrowed from, other traditions, including Buddhist and Jain traditions of cosmology. And the question is, what is this really all about, if it's so different from what we see? And it turns out it's a vast mandala for meditation. Mandala meaning circle. It is a means of focusing the mind to connect one's consciousness to the order of the cosmos and to see an order behind immediate perception, I would put it that way. Then we have Gopal Gupta, who is teaching at a university in Indiana at present, speaking about ethics, especially the question of the justification or the understanding of why there is evil in the world from a Bhagavata perspective. He elaborates, starting with other texts, Vedanta Sutra in particular. And then we have, what was his first name? In any case, Reddington, speaking about commentary to the Bhagavata. One of the reasons the Bhagavata has been so prominent in India is that it has a very rich commentarial tradition. It's also a reason why the text became, from early on, what is called a stable text. The Puranas, in general, have been very unstable. If you want to study, for example, the Skanda Purana, you have to ask from the start, which Skanda Purana do you mean? Because there are so many different manuscripts, some of them radically different from others. However, with the Bhagavata, almost all of the manuscripts are almost exactly the same. And why is that? Because the commentarial, because it's had such rich commentary, everyone wants to follow what the commentators have commented, and therefore it kind of fixes the text. Well, he's speaking about one particular commentarial tradition. Then we hear from Barbara Holdridge. She is at University of California in Santa Barbara. And she's talking about geography, and specifically sacred geography, because the central place of interest in the Bhagavata Purana is described in the 10th book, and this is a place called Vraja or Vrindavan, or Vraja Vrindavan. And this is the place where Krishna is understood to have grown up as a child, and where he has his adventures, and from which I will read a small portion later. So she speaks about, or she writes about, the notion of divine geography, which is present on this planet, and it's understood to be beyond this world altogether, where the one is, in a sense, a mirror of the other. And then we have Graham Schweig at, what's the name of his university? In Virginia? Christopher Newport University in Virginia. And he is speaking on the theology of the Bhagavata, in particular the theology of what is regarded by many as the central episode of the Bhagavata, namely the rasa dance, the dance, the divine dance of Krishna with his gopi or gopika friends, girlfriends. So he elaborates on the theology of that episode in particular. This was all about the world of the Bhagavata. Then we shift into the Bhagavata in the world. And as a transition, we have Månsbro from Finland, from Åbo Academy, speaking on heresies in the Bhagavata. The Bhagavata is perceiving that certain religious, philosophical positions are wrong, and it's defining its boundaries. And he discusses the boundaries that the Bhagavata sets, in particular with regard to Jain ideas or Jain practice and Shaiva practice. Hardly anything directly about Buddhist ideas, but also Buddhism. But then this is kind of a boundary. He's talking about boundaries, and he's talking about something which is about within the world of the Bhagavata, but it's acknowledging the world that the Bhagavata enters into or is in. But from there we go to, what's her first name? Zubko. I have the book here. Catherine Zubko. She writes about dance, because as I mentioned, the kind of central episode of the Bhagavata is this rasa dance. So if this is so significant, wouldn't it be interesting if it would also be performed? And as it happens, this has been performed by a professional dancer, and she describes in detail the mood of the dancer in dancing this dance as a form of yoga, as a form of meditation. So that's a very rich presentation. From there we go into song. There's a hugely rich tradition of devotional, of bhakti singing, which is centered in Vraja Vrindavan. And so we have Guy Beck, who is in, not Tallahassee, but he's in New Orleans teaching. Tulane University, is that possible? Yeah. He is speaking about one of those singing traditions and how that has developed since the 16th century. Then we have Elena Vilchevska speaking about recitation of the Bhagavata. If you go to Vrindavan today, you will see a bustling town which is expanding intensely over the last couple of decades. And you will see billboards advertising recitation of the Bhagavata. And these are performances which are very popular. Sometimes thousands will attend. And typically these will go over several days, following a tradition that the original Bhagavata was spoken in 7 days because the king had 7 days to live. And so he fasted and stayed awake over a 7-day and night period, hearing from Shuka, who similarly fasted and stayed awake overnight. Well, nowadays they don't do that, but they go for a few hours each day over a 7-day period, speaking and also singing portions of the Bhagavata and discussing the imports. Finally, we have Ghosh and Sardella have given a kind of text history of the text since the last 200 years as it migrates from India to the West. It was first translated into French in, I think it was 1840. It has since been translated, of course, into English a few times. There's an interesting story about that. Thomas Hopkins, Professor Thomas Hopkins did his dissertation on the Bhagavata Purana back in 1962. And then in perhaps 1968, he visited a small storefront in the Lower East Side of New York called Matchless Gifts. This was the institution which was called rather presumptuously the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, although it was this tiny storefront. He walked in there and he saw, to his amazement, copies of the first canto of the Bhagavata Purana. Now, he, as a scholar of the Bhagavata Purana, knew that previous to this, there were exactly 2 copies of the Bhagavata Purana in the entire United States. One at, I think it was at University of Chicago Library, and one possibly at Harvard. I don't know. So he was shocked. He saw that this book is there, and he asked the young man there about it, and somehow he got the impression that the translator of this new edition must be from Bengal. So he asked the young man, "Your Swami, he is from Bengal?" And the young man answered, "No, he's from India." So this text history, this was part of that history of the Bhagavata. Since then, the book has been widely distributed, especially through efforts of followers of Swami Prabhupada, but in other ways as well. It's become something of a presence in the West. So we point out 5 themes to the Bhagavata which are helpful in entering into the text. The first is the reversal or the reversing power of Bhakti. Bhakti, many of you will be familiar with the term, is typically translated simply as devotion. It comes from the Sanskrit verbal root bhaj, which means to share, and it's associated very much with many religious traditions of India, especially since the 16th century, but also from much earlier than that. And here the idea of the reversing power of Bhakti is highlighting the idea that what is presupposed in established society tends to get upended by the practice or by the imposition or by the descent of the experience of Bhakti. When I say descent, I'm suggesting another word that many of you will be familiar with, the idea of the avatar. Avatar meaning one who descends. And of course there was a popular film a few years ago called, what was it called? Avatar. Okay. Yeah. Everybody saw the film, right? Well, when that film came out, myself and some friends in Slovenia decided to organize an event, and we advertised it. The film was circulating in Slovenia, so we advertised at the program 10 avatars. It was a kind of dance and talk presentation. So the second theme of the Bhagavata is kings, avatars, and the need for social order. in some respects, the Bhagavata Purana is, you can say, socially conservative, but it's working with itself. It's a discourse in which you could say it is wrestling with social issues, and where Bhakti is always coming as the big question mark, challenging social order or presuppositions of social order. But always there is a return to the idea that that's all right, there can be Bhakti, but there has to be a foundation, there has to be a background of what is called Dharma. Again, a common word we hear so much in Hindu or discourse about Hinduism. Dharma coming from the verbal root dri, which means to support or to sustain. There needs to be something which sustains human society, which then facilitates the unfolding, the blooming of emotion, which is Bhakti. And this Bhakti is then directed not to some abstract abstraction, like an impersonal abstract reality, as is the focus in another genre of text, namely the Upanishads. Rather, the focus is on a person, and this person is referred to in general terms as Bhagavan, or the possessor of Bhaga, where the word Bhagavan, I would say, it can be translated the possessor of plenitude. And this person is then further identified more specifically as so many avatars, forms of divinity, piercing through, descending down, but you can say also piercing through the layers of material limitation. And this avatar is in particular appearing as Krishna. And so very early in the text, in the first book, is the statement, Ete Changsa Kala Pungsa, Krishna's tu Bhagavan Swayam. There are so many avatars of different function and different powers and so on. Krishna's too, but Krishna, Bhagavan Swayam, is Bhagavan himself. He is the original form. But what does this avatar do, or in this case, the tradition would argue we're no longer talking about avatar, but rather avatari, the source of avatar. What does he do? Well, what he does is known as Leela. Leela means, often translated as pastime, sometimes sport. It's the opposite of karma. Karma is that which binds, that which covers us, which holds us, or by our actions leads us to be in the grip of ignorance, of perpetuation of ignorance. Krishna pierces through that with his Leela, with his activities which are liberating, and which when one hears and one speaks about and sings and dances and remembers, one is also liberated. A fourth theme is indeed hearing and speaking about God's Leela. And indeed, this is the immediate answer of the sage who is speaking the Bhagavata to the king, who is asking the question, what is my duty? Shuka is his name, which means parrot. But he's not simply parroting. But what is his answer to the question, what is my duty? His answer is, you should hear and speak and chant and sing about the Leela of Bhagavan. That's what you should do. You've got 7 days left, so let's get to it. his point. And then he elaborates the entire 12 books. And then finally, a very key theme, a fifth key theme of the Bhagavatam, is its promise of perfection. Now, the notion of human perfection sounds either arcane or quaint or strange or maybe out of touch, but the Bhagavata is very firm on this notion that it is possible for us, specifically as human beings, to reach spiritual perfection. Siddha is the technical term, and one can reach this how? By a certain process. What is that process? That's what's elaborated in the Bhagavatam. So it's a book of hope, and it's a book which situates itself also within a certain time frame, taking the present time as being what is called the Kali Yuga, or the age of darkness, or of conflict, of degradation. Within this time period in which we find ourselves, what is to be done to rise above it, essentially. Okay, now I want to... I want to read just one very short section. Come back. Yes. Here we are. This is toward the beginning of Book 10, which concentrates on the story of Krishna, specifically Krishna. Book 10 has 90 chapters, making it by far the longest of the 12 books. And this is from chapter 8, and I've given this section the title, Krishna Eats Dirt and Yashoda Has a Vision. So Krishna is a little boy. He's a cowherd. He's just learning to herd the calves. Yashoda is his mother, or his foster mother, depending on how you read the commentaries. And something terrible is about to happen. Once, while playing, Balaram, Krishna's older brother, and other cowherd boys reported to Mother Yashoda, Krishna has eaten dirt. Desiring his well-being, Yashoda reproachfully took Krishna in her arms. Eyeing him anxiously, she spoke, "You unruly fellow, why have you eaten dirt on the sly? These boys say this, as do your buddies, and even your big brother." Krishna said, "Mother, I didn't eat dirt. They're all liars. If you think they speak the truth, then look right into my mouth." He's saying this while keeping his mouth closed. Yashoda said, "If it is so, then open wide." That said, Bhagavan, Hari is another generic name for Bhagavan, playing as a human child, freely opened his mouth, revealing his lordly might. There, Yashoda saw the universe, moving and stationary beings, the firmament, the directions, mountains, oceans with islands, the earth globe, fire and wind, the moon, planets, water, light, atmosphere, and the sky. The senses with their perceptual functions, the mind, and the totality consisting of three qualities, sattva, rajas, and tamas. She saw in the open mouth of her son's delicate body this wonderful variety, along with living beings, time, dispositions, the stock of karmic effects, and bodily differences. Seeing there Vraja village as well as herself, she became awestruck. Yashoda thought, my goodness, is this a dream, some divine magic, or the bewilderment of my own understanding, or is all this really the inherent yogic power of my child? In any case, he is truly inaccessible as he is by reason, heart, mind, endeavor, or words. From him the world appears, by him it is sustained, and in him it finally rests. I bow to the feet of him who is very difficult to comprehend. I am the fabulously wealthy wife of Raja's king. He is my husband. This is my son. The cowherd men and women with their herds of cows are mine. He by whose Maya I have such silly sentiment is my refuge. Thus, within that cowherdess who had comprehended reality, the great Lord expanded Vishnu Maya in the form of affection for her son. Just then, taking her son on her lap, Yashoda Gopi forgot the matter. She became, as before, her heart brimming with increased affection. That Lord, whose glory is sung by the three Vedas, the Upanishads, Samkhya Yoga, and Vaishnava Tantra, she considered to be her own child. So that's a little cameo from the Bhagavata. And we could analyze that passage. There's so much in it. Just structurally, there's so much. Theologically, there's so much, and so on. But I'll leave it at that because of the time. So, thank you very much. Maybe there's some question and discussion. Yeah.
I have a question. So, I have learned that the main teaching of all of the scriptures is Tatvamasi. So, you are that which you see. Is that basically the same for this?
It's not that simple. It takes 12 books to say, and 14,200 something two-line verses in Sanskrit to say it's not that simple. And the verse which we've all come to understand is somehow an essence of Veda is, of course, from the Chandogya Upanishad. It's a kind of, it's repeated a few times in one passage as a kind of litany, which then Shankara, Adi Shankaracharya, zeroed in on as an essential. That's what he called it, Mahavakya. But that Mahavakya has been a source of debate ever since by other Vedantists. And it's lesser known that, for example, Madhva Acharya, who came a couple of centuries, 3 centuries later, said, no, it doesn't say Tat Tvam Asti. Tat Tvam Asi. It doesn't say that. It says Atat Tvam Asi. And because you can do that with the Sanskrit from what was the previous word, which I don't remember, and so on and so forth. It's been the subject of huge elaboration. The what is sometimes called the Chatur Shloki, the essential 4 verses of the Bhagavatam, which is found toward the end of the 2nd book, suggests very strongly a philosophy or a theology of inconceivable simultaneous oneness and difference, where we don't sacrifice either the oneness or the difference, we keep them both, and it's inconceivable. It's achintya, how to do that. And so that's quite strongly, especially by the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition of Vedanta, it's understood this is what is being said in the Bhagavata. And then to realize that is a process, and that process is a practice, which is bhakti. Unlike Shankara, who subordinates bhakti to jnana, or spiritual knowledge, the Bhagavata keeps bhakti in an equal position, if not superior position, to jnana, where rather than suggesting, as Shankara seems to do, that once you've reached this knowledge of Tattvamasi, you can relinquish bhakti. The Bhagavata says no. When you come to this highest perfection, in fact, your bhakti fully unfolds. That's when your nature as a loving person fully unfolds, because relationship becomes fully manifest. Whereas, strictly speaking, the singularity, which the phrase Tattvamasi seems to say, or for Shankara, he emphasized that as a singularity, eliminates the possibility of relationality, which means it eliminates the possibility of bhakti. So yes, that's an important expression, but to say it's kind of, it tells the whole story, we would say in the Bhakti tradition, the Bhagavata tradition, it tells exactly half the story. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that Bhagavata Purana centers around the churning of the ocean between Daivas and Devas.
Right.
Is that a metaphor for something that the Bhagavata Purana is trying to tell us?
It can be taken metaphorically, and we can say that's one of the reasons that the text remains a living text, because it can then be applied in so many ways. But the text itself never suggests that it's an allegory. The text itself never says, now I'm going to tell you, an allegorical story. There are a couple of passages in the Bhagavata, well, one in particular, which is explicitly allegorical. So now I'm going to tell you an allegory. And then it goes on with the story. But this passage is not presented in that way. And so the tradition will take it as, I don't want to say historical, I would say rather super historical. It's not to say that it didn't happen, somebody made it up or whatever, but it's, and to say it's historical is to tie us down to our modern conceptions of what is history, which we have inherited largely from 18th century and beyond. The Bhagavata it's decentering our conventional ideas of what is reality, and that means we have to allow for possibilities of what it describes as being more real than our experience. If that makes sense. Did that make any sense? Yes.
I'm just so curious. Just thank you for your beautiful talk and your work. And I'm just so curious about your path, because in the West there's often this very strong line between the academic approach and the spiritual approach.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you started really with more being drawn spiritually, and then it went into academics, or you just kind of got surprised as you went into it more?
I wonder myself sometimes where I stand, and I sometimes have to confess maybe I'm a specimen of spiritual schizophrenia. But what I found, I started out studying in University of California, Berkeley, but after 2 years I felt I didn't know where I was going with my study, and it was time to take a break and try to gather my thoughts and my experiences, and that ended up being a 23-year break, during which time I became a Krishna monk and a you can say a missionary. But mind you, a missionary monk with a huge attraction to this tradition and a background, here comes the true confession, as a boy and as a teenager in the Unitarian Church. Figure that out. So, but after 23 years, I felt I want to go back now and look at this tradition that I've adopted through academic lenses and see what I may gain for myself, but also what I may gain for better articulating this tradition to such folks as yourselves. And I had amazing good fortune to have amazing, sympathetic, deep-thinking scholars as my professors at almost every turn when I did go back to school. I went back to University of California, Santa Barbara, and ended up in Oxford. And it's just been unbelievable good fortune with having scholars who are themselves very, I would say, spiritually deeply committed in ways that I feel have helped me to grapple with issues that one naturally comes up against or encounters in the scholarly discourse and the Western, and the traditional discourse. But I have to say it's an ongoing process for myself. One book that Houston Smith wrote not so long before his demise was called, what was it called? What was the title? It was a kind of defense of religion. Why study religion? Anyway. And there he talks about how we all suffer from tunnel vision. And he said this tunnel has 4 walls, or a floor, 2 walls, and a ceiling. And he identified the floor of this tunnel as scientism. Not science as such, but scientism, the idea that all can be known through the processes of science alone. And then a second side he identified as our educational system, which tends to trivialize religious experience, religious pursuit. The third is the media, which trivializes it even more. And the fourth, he said, is our legal system, which in the end effect, he's saying also tends to trivialize religion. perhaps, or threaten religion or suppress religion, depending which country you're speaking about, where you are. The title of the book is Why Religion Matters. Yeah. It's a nice sort of, it's not a scholarly book by any means. It's meant for a very general audience, and it's very, I found it very inspirational and also pointed to question what are we doing? What are we doing with our lives? Yes.
So you spoke about Dharma and Bhakti, both being aspects of behavior. Did you equate any of those to ethics? Would you see ethics through Bhakti or Dharma?
Nice question. You'll have to read my next book, which talks about that. And now you give me opportunity to promote my next book, which is on a quite different topic. It's called Cow Care in Hindu Animal Ethics. It's a book published by Palgrave Macmillan, and you'll be happy to know it's going to be available open access, free for digital download from, they're saying on the website now, from November 25th. It's in the Animal Ethics book series of Palgrave Macmillan, which now has some 37 titles. So in there I discuss Dharma as, and you can translate the word Dharma as ethics. But I'm suggesting in that book a kind of polarity of Dharma, Bhakti, Yoga in the middle, which ties the two together, and the three together can then address modern, what is called ethics of care, which then is applied to discourse about our relations with non-human animals. So, yes, ethics, what is ethics? Ethics is responding to the question in classical, we had Aristotle here, but we erased him. In classical, sorry, Aristotle. In classical Western ethics, it's addressing the question, what is the best way to live? Or it can also be taken as, what is the good? What is the right way to live in order to realize the good? And then the question becomes, well, what do you think is good? And so on. So both Bhakti and Dharma are concerned with this, and I put them in a polarity where Dharma is very much about boundaries, and Bhakti is very much about crossing boundaries. And they're both necessary. Because if you've only got boundaries, then it's not being completely human. And if you've only got crossing of boundaries, that can also, well, it doesn't have to be a problem, but generally it would be for society in general, at large, without boundaries. So they complement each other. And to understand Dharma in a deep sense is to understand our core identity as non-material beings, as conscious beings, who are existing beyond this body, which means prior to this body and after this body. And then to think about reality in such terms is to sort of blast away the limitations that we presuppose in all of our interactions and discourse, that the limitations of our bodies, and we forget that which is animating our bodies. Because when the self, the Atman, departs from the body, it really doesn't matter a whole lot what we do with the body. Culturally, we are concerned, how to respect the dead and so on, but the body itself, well, we typically incinerate, right? We cremate the body, or we bury it, or whatever. But we don't keep it in our living room.
I think we can make this the final question of the evening.
The lecture was very short, but was illuminating. I just wanted to know how did you meet your guru, Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada?
Yes, I met him in Paris in 1972. I had been with some of the brahmacharis of the German group, very small group in those days, and the news came that he would be visiting. He was traveling around the world several times within a very short, 12 years altogether. And during that time, I think he traveled some 14 times around the planet. And so in 72, he made a stop in Paris. We all went to visit him. And I was fortunate to meet him. And I felt, yes, here's someone in a class of his own.
Question. I'm curious about the numerology. 7 days, 12 books.
Oh.
It coincides with traditional Western numerology.
That's out of my sphere of knowledge. I never got into numerology, I must say. Have you studied?
No, but it seems strange that those two numbers.
Why those numbers? Yeah, I haven't seen whether commentaries mention anything about that. I've never come across that myself. The number 18 is rather common, and so traditionally it will be said that the Bhagavata has 18,000 verses, but the present redaction, so to say, is 14,000. I think it's between 200 and 300. And as I said, the text is very stable, which suggests that it may well always have been in its final redaction. But then the tradition will also say the Bhagavata is, after all, ultimately an oral text. And so to try to pin it down to, these what we read is not really in line with the tradition itself. Purana is an oral tradition, and therefore you can't pin it down this way. But as for the number 12, where is that from? And the number 7 we also don't see so much. The number 8 we see a lot, considered to be a very auspicious number. And a lot of things are 3 and a lot of things are 5. I don't know, 7. I don't see a whole lot of 7s. But then, I don't know so much in that sphere. I can think of a scholar who would probably have written about it back in the 60s, one Indologist. But no, I can't say more than that.
Thank you. Let's once again show our appreciation to Dr. Valpey. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Please